Be constantly itchy or constantly sticky?
What is that? What is that for a question? Where have we got to now with our life? Oh, what kind of sticky?
All right, gotta just describe the types of sticky there are, Sam. That's a tough one because both those things are horrible.
We can't always have positive questions, guys.
And if you are constantly itchy, that's going to lead to a lot of scratching and a lot of open wounds, Constantly sticky, no one wants to be your friend at that point, right? Like they always shake your hand, it's always a bit sweaty and gross. I think I'll go with constantly sticky though, because itching is just nasty. Like you have to keep scratching stuff over and over again. And having kids, I've seen them with eczema and stuff, open up wounds. It's pretty nasty. So, but sticky is just as gross. It's like wet socks, right? Ugh.
The constantly itchy one basically is like, am I now a leper? Like, do I need to go and live in a leper's colony and just hang out there? Because wounds would open. You're going to be in pain as well. It's going to be it's going to move from discomfort to pain. It's really something that's mostly going to bother you, I suppose. The sticky one's mostly going to bother other people. You sort of get used to it. There might be some cool things with the stickiness. I don't know. You never drop items. That's not a very cool thing, but it is a thing.
Will you be able to crawl up a wall like Spider-Man or something?
Yeah.
I guess Spider-Man's sticky, right? He gets on okay.
Yeah, I think the itchy is a big problem. I once got super sunburnt at the beach, way too much, that then my body had an allergic reaction to it. And it was like having ants, I don't know, biting you on the back kind of thing. It was just this kind of itchy feeling, and it was the worst thing ever. I don't know. I don't know if I've had an experience that was so frustrating and terrible because you couldn't do anything about it. So I think it would be that kind of that would add to it, the fact that you're not able to resolve that situation, you're not able to alleviate, right? So sticky would just be about discomfort and feeling a bit yuck, but I think that's preferable.
Welcome to Itch and Stick, a podcast by 3 random people. Please let us know your horror itchy stories in the comments below. Don't do that. Don't do that, guys.
The biggest downside, though, for being constantly sticky would be playing board games, right? Everything you touch gets a little bit of ooze on it. It's going to be gross. No one would want to play board games with you. I wouldn't want to play my own board games. Laminate everything.
Superpower, though, playing rugby. People go to tackle you, and they're like, oh, what is this? Right? And they're grossed out. Although maybe if you're too sticky, then they're all just going to attach to you as you're walking down with 6 or 7 of the opposition team attached to you. I got to go. I got to go sticky. As weird and gross as it is, the itchy is worse.
It's a good point, though. I mean, we're doing a podcast about board games, right? And this one would pretty much eliminate your possibility to play board games in a physical way, or to have people who play with you. You might be able to still be a solo gamer, right?
I mean, Jenga would be great if you're constantly sticky. That's one plus for board games. Just one finger, tip of your finger, pull out whatever piece you want. Easy.
Are there any other board games that stickiness could provide an advantage?
Any game with a bank, go to pick up a piece, but with your pinky finger, pick up another piece of coin. If you're a cheater, that is.
Welcome to the Lens and Veil podcast. Join Shem, Sam, and Zach as they dive into a designer-focused analysis of Nippon, a game from Nuno, Bizarro, Sentieiro, and Paulo, Soledade.
This week we are talking about Nippon. This is a game that was made in 2015. It's set in Japan. It's sort of industrial era, where there's a theme of us, in industry, making a bunch of different products to gain influence in different areas, all with a quest to make more money, the yen, and then turning that, leveraging that economy into victory points. This is a game that has a really interesting flow to it. It's what I would call a worker drafting game, where there are 6 pools, where there are 3 workers in the pool initially, and each of the pools are attached to 2 actions, except there is one action where there is one pool where there is one action. On your turn, you're going to draft a worker. There are workers of 6 different colors. Now, these workers actually, they don't change the action at all. They don't change the type of action or any bonuses on that action. But all the workers that you have drafted will be held in this area on your player board. And this kind of this track, so they move from left to right. And eventually you're going to take a rest or a consolidate action where all the workers that you've drafted go back into the bag, and you have to pay 3,000 yen for each different color of worker. So you really want to draft the workers of the same color to prevent paying such a high cost. But the actions that you want to take might not have workers in that pool of those colors. Once a pool has run out of workers, then workers are placed into that pool from this little holding area on the left. There are a certain number of these holding areas based on player count. And once all the holding areas have run out, then we advance the kind of the in-game tracker. And every 2 advancements will trigger a scoring phase where all of our influence on the map will score a sweet, sweet victory points, which creates this really interesting flow and some really cool timing elements with a good amount of predictability of what is to come. Players have a fair bit of control over the end game, and once we've had 2 scoring phases and 1 more kind of reset area, then we only have 3 turns left. And then after those 3 turns, we will add up the final scores to see who is the victor.
So I wouldn't want to overuse this term too much because it gets thrown out quite a bit, but I think this game is a perfect example of a game that is very elegant. What I mean by that is you probably know what it means, but anyway, what I mean is that every piece of this game is quite simple. There's no overly complicated mechanisms in the game. There's not like, oh, when you take this specific action, it's like do these 17 steps in this order. Every action is very simple, and most of the actions in the game are simply pay one of 3 possible yen amounts to get one of 3 possible outcomes. And those outcomes are very simple. You might spend, I think it's like 5, 10 or 15 yen to place 1, 2 or 3 trains. And those trains have to go into different regions. And that's how simple it is. Even like the fact that the worker you take, like Sam said, the color has no bearing on the action itself. There's no like additional layer to think through. But the game is still quite deep in its like thinking space, the decision space. So it's not a light game by any means, but it's not convoluted, I guess. That's the word that gets thrown around quite a bit in the heavier board game scene, is that the game is overly complex or convoluted. This game is definitely not that. It's very clean, very well designed, with lots of little systems that you can easily manage.
Yeah, straight away, as you get into the game, you understand, oh, I see how this draft works. Your first action, you're kind of looking around to see what workers are there a lot of at the moment, right? And so you'll go for the action that you want to do and pick the most common worker. But someone else might go for that most common worker, and then they become a contested worker. And once those pools run out and new workers get added, it's very likely that it's a different color that is now in vogue, so to speak. So that kind of like that immediate understanding of the depth and like how this core loop of the worker draft is going to play out is really interesting. Like the player is brought into it straight away, and they're thinking meaningfully about what others are doing straight away, but it doesn't hold too much weight in their mind. Like it's not like a crazy AP thing, but it's a nice little consideration between the players.
Yeah, with the worker color system, it reminds me a bit of games like Asara and Keyflower, where the players are in control of how in demand something is based on the color. So there's a lot of like cheeky plays you can do. Probably get some salty plays where like say there's like 3 reds and Sam takes a red. So I'm like, you know what? I'll take a red as well. Just to like kind of get in someone's face and get in their way. That's in Asara and Keyflower as well, where like it's not just about doing your own thing, it's about trying to get in someone else's way as well.
Yeah, although in this game, every different sort of worker that you have is going to cost you for the next round. If you have too many different colors, it's going to negatively affect your next round after you reset, basically. So you are kind of disincentivized into competing with other players for their colors, but inevitably it does happen, especially when there's an action that you need to do and maybe that's the only color that's there, right? I really like the fact that you can also see these refill pools, because you can also plan out your color according to the next one that you know is going to be refilled, right? So you can kind of have that forward thinking and not just look at the workers that are in the current pools on the actions, but also look at those which are upcoming. And another thing I find really interesting is that they have 2 actions on each action spot. So it often happens that maybe in a round you want to do 2 actions in the same action spot, and you can do that, unlike some other worker placement games where maybe, you know, you've done that action one time and then you have to do it from another spot or something like that. Here you can just keep going to the same spot, but obviously it's unlikely that you're going to have like three workers of the same color in that same spot. So it's more likely that you're going to be taking a financial hit in your next turn, having to pay all those different worker types if you're going to want to keep on repeating that same action. So that kind of creates some interesting push and pull around, not being able to easily abuse a specific area of the game without it then costing you. And so you have to kind of be smart about how you're going to plan out the, five, four, well, I mean, you can choose when to reset, but you often want to try and get 5 or 6 actions before you're resetting. And you have to be really clever in how you plan them out to try and have as few worker colors as possible.
Yeah, there's this interesting point in our games where, we're considering these workers for so much of the game and which one we're going to draft. And it's quite a big decision once you've committed to a color and then there are no more of that color or there's no more of that color in the actions that you want to take. The next decision point is, okay, what's the next color that I'm going for? And there was a point in our games where the refill pills are completely out. And the next time something gets refilled, we're going to have a whole new set of pulls that have been seeded. And it feels like we're in the dark, like something that we rely on in the previous turns in the game, that we can look to the left-hand side of the board, know what workers are going to come out, and then plan around that. There's these moments in the game when you're in the dark and you just have to make a call. And that was really interesting, just like creating this slight change in game state and play a decision at those points in the game where we don't have as much information. And you realize how much you relied on that information beforehand, which is quite cool. So one of the things I want to talk about in this game is what the designers have done with their sort of costings of actions. We haven't gone over what all the actions are, but they've set prices for a few of these actions, quite a few of these actions in yen, in the money that people have. And 2 of them are about boosting tracks. You have 3 tracks in this game. You have an income track, which is how much money you make or you draw up to when you consolidate. You have a coal track, which is the same, but for coal, how much coal you draw up to when you consolidate. And then there's a knowledge track, which is kind of like this progressive requirement for building new factories. And knowledge is something that you don't spend. It's just like, do I have this knowledge or not? You can augment it with blueprints, which are a resource that temporarily increase your knowledge. But 2 of these actions, to boost your knowledge and to boost your coal income, there are 3 options for the player. You could spend 1 yen to boost it 1 step, 3 yen to boost it 2, or 6 yen to boost it 3. So it's the classic triangular scoring numbers. And I love this tension in games. I love that it's like, if you want to be turn efficient, you're going to pay top dollar. You're going to pay 6 yen for 3 bumps. So that's 2 yen per bump. But if you want to be resource efficient, if you're poor, then you're going to pay 1 yen to bump once. And so it's this tension for players of, do you want resource efficiency or do you want turn efficiency?
Yeah, and most of the actions allow you to do up to, 2 or 3 things in that action. So even the influence action, which is about using your goods, so you're not paying money, but you're using your goods to place influence onto the cities, you can place up to 3 tiles. And so you really want to be efficient in terms of getting all your tiles out there, but also you have limited tiles, limited influence tiles. So you only have a certain number of each number of influence, and certain resources convert into certain numbers. But essentially you get to the point where to be efficient, you have to build up a whole bunch of resources before you're able to place all 3 tiles out. So then maybe you're missing out on a scoring phase. So then you're kind of forced into maybe just placing 1 tile out. So at least you take part in the scoring phase. So there's all this tension of like, I want to maximize the action, but there's this timing in the game that's forcing me into making other decisions to try and get amongst the points, because there's this tempo. It's a quick game. It's not just about this grand strategy that's going to pay off at the end. There's these points that are going to pay you off during the game.
These kinds of decisions, and there's actually a lot of in Nippon in this game, I like to call like bait for min-maxes, where it's like, if you lay all of your ducks in a row, you can do this really, really sweet action. And so min-maxes want to make sure that they can get that action perfectly. Like they can do all of the things really, really well. But in setting that up, often you're being inefficient. You're like having to do so many steps and so many little turns to make that one awesome turn that you're planning for, that it's actually like ends up being inefficient. That kind of agony for min maxes trying to figure out, okay, how can I try to make the most of this action is really, really interesting. And one of the ways they do it is having diminishing returns on like the luxury, the expensive option for those actions. So really clear in the boosting the knowledge and coal tracks example, but even the actions where you get to place out a boat or a train, where it seems like actually they've got a set cost of 5 yen for each one that you want to put out. So you could spend 5, 10, or 15 to place out 1, 2, or 3. The part that makes it diminishing returns is that you have to place them in unique regions. And so typically when you get to the third region that you're placing a boat or a train out in, you actually don't want it as much. You want to try and stack into 1 or 2 where you know you can leverage their power. And so going to the third one, in a sense, is a different way of doing diminishing returns, but it's that really sweet luxury item for the min-maxers that want to spend their big cash.
And also how these scoring objectives on your player board work is that if you can get up to the max amount of workers on your player board, then you're going to get a ×5 on that objective, and you choose what the objective is. But to get up to 5 workers, can't remember if it's 5 or 6 on your player board, you have to play really well, and you probably won't be able to min-max those actions because you're going to need to take a whole bunch of actions in a row, which might not set up to do, the placing 3 tiles. It might only set you up to place 1 or 2 when you do that action. But you really want to be min-maxing that as well. So there's almost this tension between min-maxing the actions, which maybe it would be better to reset more often. But actually, you don't want to reset more often because then you're missing out on these in-game scoring tiles. I think this is a really clever part in the game. And I like what you call it there, Sam, about the bait for min-maxers.
Yeah, there's a lot of really subtle things in this game that do drive that tension that Zach has mentioned a few times. So we've talked about the coloured workers. That's obviously a tension about later effects or later costs that could kind of come to you when you consolidate. There is that other tension of getting more workers to get the extra point scoring tiles and the bonuses from those tiles. And there's the tension of your yen and your coal for the round. When you consolidate, you get a certain number of those 2 resources, and those drive, I think it's like 7 of the 9 actions. You have to spend these resources. And like Sam was saying earlier, like you can go heavy on like one big action and in a way just like destroy your resources in the area. Or you can do lots of little actions and kind of slow ball towards these big goals for getting the right workers and stuff. So the decision space for the resource spending and trying to achieve these little kind of mini goals in a way is very simple and very subtle, but it's almost like the culmination of all those things create this quite heavy tension at the table. Whereas they're not that big decisions really, but it's the flow and effect of like, if I do this big action now, then my other actions are useless. And maybe when I do consolidate, I'm wasting 3 yen or 3,000 yen. I can't use it because I can't get a worker for that action. I can't afford it or whatever it might be. And then underneath all of that, which I think what brings the game together, is those scoring phases. It's like you try and do your little thing in your little corner and achieve what you think you can do with each action. But then there's this constant pressure of like, as soon as these workers start disappearing and those pools start refilling each time, we can see them like progressing. And there's this big tension of like, will I control 1 or 2 regions or maybe 3 regions if I can? Or do I just abandon that and go for my personal objectives instead? So it's just really, really good in that way that it's like nothing is overly complex, but the tensions that come together like a web almost of all these little things piling up is what makes the game have its like appeal and its kind of brain burn of like trying to min-max when you can't really do it in most cases.
So let's talk about consolidating a little more, because I think this is one of the real strengths of the game. There's a trend, there's a lot of kind of Euro games that try to keep this idea of a flow going without having any rounds or reset phases. And a lot of these games will have a turn where it's essentially your rest turn, right? You do something to like clear off your player board or draw stuff from your bag or something like that to make sure that the flow can keep going. And I think this game does it really, really well with Consolidate. So we've already mentioned the fact that like you're going to have to pay 3,000 yen per worker color that you had collected over the other action phases when you consolidate. Also the fact that you're going to be holding them in different spots like on the track, and then the more workers that you did collect, the more actions that you took before consolidating will allow you better bonuses higher up the track, getting those multipliers higher. But then the other really, really cool thing, Shem alluded to it, was the income tracks, where it's not that you lose stuff that you haven't used, not really, but it's that you only fill up to what your level of income is. So it feels like you've lost it. It feels like you absolutely lost it, that you were supposed to spend everything down to 0 so that you get a max refill both on your coal and on your yen, on your money. And I think this is fantastic. This is, again, that min-maxer bait. Because when you consolidate with coal left over, you feel like, oh, I've wasted it. I haven't made the most of that coal, which encourages players to really fine-tune the balance of their economy. The other thing is that a lot of these games, when you have these turns to consolidate or to rest, they can either be really long and slow, or they could just be not fun. Like they're the dumbest turns and you try to avoid them at all costs. But in this game, I think they've done it really well. And I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, because you get to take a tile that not only will lock in multiplicative scoring on one area of the game, but it also gives you a boost. It just gives you a one-off 2 coal, 5,000 yen, or 2 blueprints. And getting to balance out your weak area of your economy of those 3 track is a really interesting decision. And I think it's quite a fun turn in this game.
It is actually really interesting because there is that instant bonus decision. Obviously, sometimes during the game, those will be used up. So actually, there's also another element of being like, oh, all the 3, if I stop at 3 workers, I'm not going to be able to get the bonus, the instant bonus I want. So I need to go to 4 workers, otherwise I won't be able to get, the 2 contracts or whatever that I need. So that's even adding another element to that thought process before. But the fact is that you get this instant bonus, but then you also get the multiplier score tile, and you have a choice in that moment. So it's not just about passively doing some stuff, but it's actually also a moment of choosing where you think you're going to score the most points. Because basically on your player board, you have these different sort of areas of the game, whether it's like the better factories, and each of them, I think, go up to 4. So you're only maximum getting 4 for each of these things, but you can multiply them up to 5 according to these multiplication tiles. And the thing is, you get them very early in the game as well. And so you have to be thinking ahead of like, okay, where do I think I'm going to be able to max out these 4 points on this objective? And so where should I put the multiplier tile? And so that adds some really interesting and tense decisions to that rest turn, shall we say. And I think another interesting thing that I think we all remarked on when we're playing it is that, for example, the South Tigris games from Shem and Sam all have a rest phase. And generally that rest phase is moving along the game towards the end game. Like Wayfarers is in Inventors, it's the end of the round. In Scholars, is it moving the game along?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's drawing out more cards from the scroll deck. Yeah.
It's drawing out more cards. So each of the rest phases is moving the game along. And this game is not actually, because actually taking workers is what's moving the game along. Yeah. But the reason why you don't rest super often is because you want to be getting those bonus tiles, because you want to be using all your resources, as Sam was saying. You don't want budget left over. But actually, you could be resting after 1 turn and it's not actually speeding up the game. It would actually be slowing down the game, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned, Zach, about these multiplying tokens, I find it's more of a tough choice in the game when your first one is like a ×3 or a ×4.
Yeah, hard out.
And you're like, okay, what do I think I'll do like okay at? Like, because you want to save your 5, right? Like you might get maybe 2 5s in the game if you really try, maybe more. But you're like, I think I can get all the factories this round. I'll get 6 factories, but will you actually do it? Like, how do you know, like from the start of the game, that you're going to achieve that? So I find that decision interesting. When you get like a ×2, that's a little bit easier because like, oh, I probably won't do this. So you throw in something you've maybe partly achieved and you don't think you do better, but those 3s and 4s are a tough choice. The other thing you kind of touched on a bit was about the economy, and Sam talked about it as well, how that tension of like, if you don't spend the money or the coal before you consolidate, it's a bit of a waste. What I find the game does is like, you've got 3,000 yen left over. You could do this action which costs 3,000 yen right now and get this thing. Except that the color of worker you need is not the right color. So when you do rest, that's going to cost you 3,000 yen. And it's like, does my brain in trying to figure out like, is this optimal? Like it's advanced you towards getting one of those scoring tokens, but it's like you're kind of just going sideways or backwards on the money. So it's a tough choice.
I love a good puzzle where you could sit there and think about it for a while, and all you know is that there are trade-offs, but you can't actually resolve what's better. And I think this does that really well. Like you can't just sit there and math it out and be like, yes, this is 3,000 better, but then I've lost a turn. Like the opportunities are going to change, and like it's just kind of nuanced, and you'll get a different scoring tile locked in. So there's just a lot of factors kind of on both sides for the early rest versus delay and stall and take smaller actions, but more of them before consolidating.
So, how about we talk a little bit about the area control element of the game? I'm the guy that likes fighty games, and it's pretty important. The kind of influencing the cities, winning the regions. You can also remove other people's influence tiles. So basically, you have influence tiles from 1 to 7, and according to the type of good you use, and according to how much of the good you use, there's a chart which converts that into influence. And obviously, the better factories that create better goods give you the max influence. So if you've got a 7 out there, nobody can remove that, lock that in. But if you've got anything under a 7, I mean, depending on the good, because some goods can't go up to 7. So if you've got the max number for that good, it's okay. But if you've got under that, people can go in there, get rid of more resources than you did, and trump your little influence token. So not only add influence to the region, but also swing it really hard because they've taken away your influence. So it is quite like aggressive in a lot of more modern games. When bad stuff like that happens, you get something like a reward, but you only just get that influence tile back, so you can use it again. But there's not really any like that are like, oh, have a consolation because you just got wrecked by someone. So it's quite cutthroat, I think, in that way, the influence game. And I remember in our second game, like Sam had a turn where he placed 2 influence, and I think he took out 2 of my influence tiles, and it was like devastating. I'm like, oh man, I should have, instead of placing 2 tiles, I should have just placed 1 that was the max number in that resource, and I would still be in that region, and I would still get some points. So that's another interesting factor is you feel like you want to min-max that action and put out more influence tiles, but that might mean you are spreading out your resources between 3 influence tiles rather than putting in like 1 or 2 max of that type of resource influence that no one can remove. And you think you're being smart, but in the end, if someone comes in and wipes you out, you just wasted those resources essentially, apart from an instant bonus that you get when you place them.
Yeah, and that instant bonus is game design genius. Like, we put a lot of instant bonuses in our games. Sometimes there's a lot of thought that goes into it, but a lot of the time it's like, this feels good, it's fun, like, let's do that. And this instant bonus does have that, but what it's really doing is what you've said, it's playing on people's greed. So the region, there are 4 regions on the map. Each region has 2 cities, and each city has 4 different types of goods that they'll receive, which essentially are slots for you to place your influence tiles. So if you can line it up, like Zach is saying, you can place 2 different influence tiles from selling the same good into that region, 1 on each city, which would allow you to gain the instant benefit twice. So if you're sitting there with a possible 3 influence to make, you're very tempted to put down a 1 and a 2 to get the instant bonus twice. But if you're actually playing the area control game, placing down the 3 is a lot harder, or actually impossible in some scenarios, to usurp. So they're playing on people's greeds. Like, placing down 2 is nice, it gets me the bonuses I need now, but someone's going to come in and knock you out, and then you might have nothing when it gets to the scoring phase. Really cool tension.
And the other part that's kind of pushing against you spending all your resources are those contracts. So if you go heavy on the map, you're spending 3 each time for each influence you place, or 2 or 3. That means you're not getting many leftover resources. And the contracts kind of want you to have leftover goods, not resources, but goods. So most of the contracts require like 1 or 2 of different types of goods to fulfill them. These things give you points, they give you income bumps and immediate effects, mostly yen, I think. So if you go very light on the map, that leaves a lot of leftover goods to also go into the contracts. Or you can just go full contracts and ignore the map. I'm not sure how viable it is to win the game. You have to be somewhat competitive. But if you go really heavy on the map, and I think my last game I tried this, I went heavy on the map and had nothing for contracts. It was really, for me, it was a decision of either or. Do I go contracts or map? There was no middle ground. But looking at it now, there is this middle ground where you can just drop off little 1s and 2s and then have a few leftover goods and then do some contracts, and then maybe build up your engine to later come in with your big, like, higher cost ones that overbuild.
I think it's important to say, quick adding on to that you don't only get points if you're the first player in the region. Also, the second and I think the third also get points. And the first 2 players get to score bonus points off their ships. So you don't have to be the highest in the region, but if you're not present, you're not getting points.
Yeah, and I also like with that how there's the neutral player. So on the map, each city has a 1, 2, and a 3 around it. And you can place any token on top of these. There's no restrictions about going higher than that number. But I like how from the very start, there's this neutral opponent, like, competing for first, second, or third. What it does for the game, especially, is the scaling of the game. So even in a two-player game, I've played two-player once, that neutral player is very competitive. Even in our three-player game, we noticed today, they often came second and you sometimes first, but it makes the game or the map state very interesting from the start. If those weren't there and someone placed their first influence, they're like dominating the map at that point. But often when you place your first influence, you might be in second place unless you cover a 3 with another 3 or a 4 or something. So I like how that's just always there from the start, keeps it interesting. And on top of that, I like how the scoring phases, there's 3 of them, how the points for each region ramp. So they start out very small, like you don't have to invest much to get, a few points, but by the end of it, it's like it's worth spending your entire turn to try and swing a region, because that 20-point bonus for coming first in the last time. And as Zach was saying earlier about how the ships, like if you've invested heavily in a region with ships, each ship is like 2 or 3 points each that you have in there for bonus points. If you come second or first, you need to win that region or come second in that region. If you have invested all these ships and then you just lose control of that region, that's a massive point swing for you. So I like how the game has this very cool map dynamic state of things changing, but you kind of start to invest over the course of the game and find your foothold and stuff.
2 actions that are really easy to understand and pretty cool are the ship placement and the train placement. So you can place these ships and trains into slots around the regions, and there are 8 slots, although those decrease with fewer players. So once the slots are all gone, it's gone. And it's a cool tension for the player deciding between trains and boats. So boats will, as Shem has said, boats will give you points if you're in first or second in influence in those areas. But trains will allow you to increase your influence by 2 in those areas. So if you go the greed play, going for boats, thinking that you're going to have the highest influence, but other people usurp you, those boats might not get you anything. But if you go all in on trains and you didn't need them, then they become sort of obsolete. You've already got the most influence. So it's a cool thing, opting into essentially combat strength, if this was a combat game, or better victory rewards, and that's a great tension for the players. Really easy to understand. And if you unlock one of each for every kind of pair that you unlock, you get to bump your income as well. So that's just a nice little Brucey bonus, as we like to say.
So we have talked a lot about the yen and the coal, and we've been talking a bit about the goods and how they're used for buying influence on the map and by fulfilling contracts. But how we get from the yen and from the coal to the goods, there's 6 different types of goods in the game. They come from the factories that you can build, which is one of the most important actions in the game, really. And often the first action you'll take in the game is to build a factory. There's a lot of layers going on here. So there are 6 types. There are kind of 3 tiers of these types, and each tier there are 2. So the bottom, I'm going to forget the names, but I think it's like silk and cotton or something along those lines, is the first kind of lower tier ones. These can get to a maximum of 3 influence, a token of 3. The next tier up, there's 2 more types of factories, which go, I think it's 3, 4, 5, I think it is. And then there's another tier above that, which goes 5, 6, 7. So you often start with a small one. And if you get that knowledge track up that we talked about higher, or get more of these blueprints, you can then start getting these bigger factories. But what they do is they give you a choice when you get a factory to choose one of the available of that type that you want. So if you really want, say, let's just call them colors. Let's say you want the green factory. There's going to be, I think it's 4 different green factories you could get, and they're all unique, which I really like in the game, how there's this kind of slight deviation between game to game where you can try something different. It's subtle, but it's there as well. Some of these will give you an immediate effect, like when you build this, gain 5,000 yen, but most of them will give you an ongoing ability. Some will just be basic, like they'll lower the amount of coal you need to spend to use that factory. I think it's one of each color for that power, I think. But most of them do cool stuff, like flip over all of your trains, so they're +3, not +2. Or when you buy ships, they're now 3,000 yen cheaper for each ship you buy, that kind of stuff. And then the other cool element of this, there's a lot to go into the factories, but the other cool thing is there's another action which makes your factories produce more goods. So by default, when you use a factory, it makes 1 good. But if you get these, I don't know what they're called, but if you get these tokens that go +1 or +2, every time you spend the same number of coal for that action each time, you're making more and more goods, which means you can do more powerful actions on the map or do more contracts.
There's this mirroring effect actually with this game where that same tension with the workers of once we've taken a few turns each, I'm looking over at my opponents and seeing what colors of workers they've drafted. And there might be a point where I have to choose which person I'm going to annoy out of those 2. There might be a purple and a black at the action spot that I want. Shem's going for purple, Zach's going for black, and I have to choose. And so the other player is the one that benefits, the one that I didn't like take worker of their colors. There's a similar tension of that with the factories as well, where it's like at the start of the game, there is basically silk and paper are the factories that we can produce just because we don't have the knowledge that's high enough to get the higher tier factories. All right, so I go for silk. In my first action, I buy a silk factory. Then Shem comes along and he buys a paper factory. Now Zach has to make a decision. He has to build a factory. It's inconceivable to play this game without building factories. You've got to do it. Like both of the scoring actions with the contracts and the map require factories. But Zach, he can't get a lens factory. He can't get a bento factory. He doesn't have enough blueprints or knowledge for that. So he's got to pick. He's going to pick which of these resources or influence types are contested. Now, I think in our first game, we all actually went for the same type of factory. And so it was a very heavily contested factory. But this is a really cool layer of interaction. Obviously, it can kind of be a little kingmakey, but I don't actually have a problem with that. I don't think it's kingmaking in a bad way. I just think it's a really interesting decision that the players have to make and ways they can interact with each other, kind of finding a gap in the market and seeing ways that you can fill that gap and benefit the most.
Yeah, and there is a play, I think in our second game, I skipped the first tier factory. I went straight for the second tier factory by kind of boosting my knowledge track, picking up some bonus plans, and yeah, I can't remember exactly the sequence of actions I took. So, I mean, there is a play around that to be like, I'm going to go for the second tier way before everyone else. So it gives me a head on putting out that type of influence. But eventually someone's probably going to buy that same second tier factory, right? So it's still valid. And it is interesting to think about like whether it's worth trying to rush the high level factories or slowly working up. Because I mean, I haven't played the game enough times to know that, but maybe it is a valid strategy to like rush the max level factories so that you can place out your 7 influence in the first, before the first scoring phase and just like mega score on 2 regions for the whole game. So yeah, I think the whole factory thing is interesting. I think when we played it, after we played it the second time, we'd be like, it'd be nice if there's more factories. And then we looked up and we saw that there was an expansion that adds more factories. And so that was nice as well. And another thing is we're always baited into getting the factories with the cool points. But Sam reflected on it and was like, maybe it would be smart to get the factory that costs less coal. Like maybe that is actually better than some of the ones I've been getting. But as a player, you naturally go for like, oh, I want a discount or I want like an instant bump on that track. And that's the interesting thing, actually. I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but I think about half of the factories are like instant bonuses and half of them are ongoing bonuses, or no, maybe one of each type is an instant bonus. So you can also just buy a factory that gives you an instant bump on one of the tracks. You have some interesting decisions in each of the factory types and what they're going to give you, and each factory kind of focuses on a different area of the game. So you might rush a type of factory that also is going to work into one of those tracks that you're wanting to max out of the game.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure from memory that all the factories from a certain type of good have a very similar flavor. So one was about trains. There's one that says like flip all your trains to their +3 side. One says place 2 trains for free. And the other one says when you buy trains, they cost like 3,000 yen less. And they all function the same way. There's one that will give you like some coal, one that will boost your coal track, one says when you get coal, do this thing. So like the factory type you choose is already telling you it's good in this area, but how do you want to be good in that area? Which does help the decision space a bit for me, where it's like if I've got a choice of like 3 different factory types I could build. I'm already like, oh, I want to do trains. I'll go for, I think it's the green or whatever it might be. And then I'm like, oh, there's another layer of decision right now. Like, which little bonus do I want with trains, which is cool. But yeah, I think that the coolest part about this really is how you guys have mentioned it, how it's that map restraint of like all the like if someone's going heavy on, say, black factories and no one else has a black factory, then like no one can overbuild them on the map. That's the biggest tension and thing that I think I missed when I was playing was like seeing that control and trying to counter it. You can either try and counter it by getting other factories in that city and going higher on those values or overbuilding with stronger factories.
I think something that makes a game elegant and yet deep is where a player can play the game and understand how all the rules work and understand how all the mechanisms work, but not understand the consequences or the implications of the things that they do. So they know like how to move the parts around, they know like how to resolve everything perfectly, but not actually understanding like the ramifications of decisions that they make. And Shem, you mentioned that you had this, and I also had this in my second play. I realized the power of the 3 the 5, and the 7 influence tiles. So for the tier 1, the tier 2, and the tier 3 good types, that is the highest influence tile you can place in those cities for requiring that type. And so that means they have immunity. They cannot be bumped out. So understanding like which area I'm going for, and if I can get that 3 or the 5 or the 7 in their relative positions locked down is super powerful. But this is something I did not see or understand completely in my first play. And realizing that it's a way to improve at the game, and it's also a way to get in your opponent's face with the interaction. I thought that's really cool. I'm really interested to hear what you guys think, actually. Like, did you enjoy the interaction? What do you think about the interaction in this game?
I enjoyed it when I realized kind of, as you said, like the consequence of the decisions, because for me, that was a learning moment, for example, in that game where I think I'd placed down like a 1 and a 2 influence and got the double bonus. And then Sam comes along and places like a 2 and a 3 on top of my ones and eliminates me from that region. And that felt really bad in that moment because, as I said, you don't get any bonus for people placing over you. There's no consolation. It's just tough luck. You should have been, you should have put higher influence in there. But that kind of taught me that lesson, which Sam was talking about how powerful putting the highest number of influence of each good type is, and how you're really wanting to, if you're wanting to contest regions and win regions, you're wanting to go for investing more goods into a single spot rather than spreading out your goods across, 2 different cities to get more influence tiles out. So I think now that I understand better how the area control works, and also the trains and the boats, that kind of system is really interesting. Also in our second game, I came last in both games. I'm just going to say, I was outplayed. But in the second game, the last play, I was like, I can build 2 trains or 2 boats. And I don't know which one's better. And, I think that, and then I was just like, I'll do 2 boats. And then after we finished, I was not too many points behind Shem. And then I'm like, oh man, I'm such an idiot. If I put 2 trains, I would have beaten Shem in this region, which would have done a point swing. And I would have tied in this other region. And like, it actually would have moved me into second place. Sam was still well ahead of us. So just those kind of like those little decisions can have such a big impact on the area control game. So I think after playing 2 games, I say I quite like it, and I would enjoy playing another game and trying to do better in that kind of map control from what I've learned from the 2 games. So I felt like there's been progression.
Yeah, the interaction here is really about keeping an eye on your opponent's potential in every area of the game. So, and also their motivations in the game. So there's the worker colors we've talked about quite a few times, where like seeing what is their motivation, what color do they want. You may be able to speculate what action they may be doing, and if they're likely to put out influence tokens in the next few turns, that kind of thing. But also seeing what factories they have, their potential to overbuild or overplace on the map where you want to go. This is something I guess I missed in the BGA interface. I wasn't really paying attention to what these guys are doing in our first game especially, and even still not that much in the second game. But if you're at the table and you're about to place down some paper influence on the map, you really want to look around the table and go, who else has paper factories? How many goods do they have currently on their board? And that kind of stuff. There's a lot to think about the interaction. And I think why I like it, I do like the interaction this for the reason that there's no hidden information. Everything is out there on the table. There's no like draw of a card or randomness that comes into play which you feel shafted. So the interaction really is about like how much can you retain and how much can you anticipate what your opponents might do. Last episode, or I think the last 2 episodes, we've talked a bit about the multiplicative scoring in games where you get 6 of this thing and then 7 of this thing, and you get these 42 points or whatever from this crazy combination of these 2 things. And we've all kind of agreed we don't like that in games because the blowouts of the scores just get crazy, and it makes the little points you get here and there feel very minimal, insignificant. I think it was during our first game, I suddenly clicked, like, actually, all these elements that you can multiply cap out about 4 or 5. I think most are 4. So in a way, when you place one of these ×4 or ×5 multipliers on a thing, you already know like it's limited to about 20 points. Probably get lower than that if, because the game, you can't do everything in the game. So that decision maybe isn't as interesting when you realize that. But I do like that there are no big point blowouts in these multipliers. You can specialize and you can focus, but ultimately they're going to cap. And that's more how like most of our games will be, where we try and cap things, especially say in a game like Paladins, got cards that say like score a point for every 2 of this thing. And that thing can never be more than 3. So it's like you've maxed out at 3 points for a card. Or there are some that break that rule for us, but in most cases, we'll try and design games where there can't be these massive blowouts. And they've clearly done the same thing here where they've kind of rigged it where you can't just go crazy into one area and abuse the system. Another thing I like about this little scoring thing they have with the grid of things you will qualify for is that I think it's 2 of them already come with a ×1 multiplier. So you'll definitely score your leftover resources, the yen and the coal, and you'll definitely score a point for every star on your knowledge track. Now you can overbuild those, you can make them higher, but the game is kind of telling you you don't need to do this. Like you don't have to enter this. This is something you're going to score anyway, but you can. So I think the game is telling you really like do the other things more. But in the case that you do happen to lean in crazy into this one thing, you can score more for it if you want to.
Yeah, this actually is a conversation topic really around like not just multiplicative scoring, but like the 2 different approaches to it. And we like to talk about trade-offs. And I think this is really an interesting trade-off here where if you do cap them out, if you somehow have like an artificial cap or the way that you allow the scoring to happen, like what they do on these tracks is you don't just get a point per bump on the track, you get a point per star you've reached on the track. And they've set it so that there's only 4 stars on the track. So that's not artificial, but it's a way that they have reduced the ceiling, the potential of these things. As one, it sort of feels a little bit muted. Like it feels like the potential for it to be awesome and amazing has been reduced. And I think that's the dark side of the coin. But the positive is that you don't have these blowouts. You don't have these crazy, ridiculous scores. You don't have these players that are just doing one thing, spamming it really hard, multiplying it by 17 and winning the game off of that. So we ended up with a design decision around that actually with inventors of the South Tigris. We've got in that game, there are 40 plus inventions, these devices that you can create. And each of them has a unique scoring condition, which is pretty interesting for allowing different play styles in the game and for players to opt into something really cool that they want to score, which creates this cool customization. It creates this cool emergent direction in the game. But we originally had it that like each of them said something like 1 point per X, and it would tell you this thing that you would get points for. One of the things was that it was really hard when we did that model to have all of those 40 different versions of X have the same potential. And even if they don't need to have the same potential, they should have the same average potential. So what I mean by that was like, if they've got a really low floor and a high ceiling, that might be okay. But there were some that just had low floors and low ceilings, or there were some that had like high floors and high ceilings. And so the averages of them weren't consistent either. And these device cards, when they were done in that way, were cool because it brought out more of that emergent direction. It brought out really interesting stories at the end of the game about the way you scored your points, which was quite unique from game to game. But it did lead to blowouts. It did lead to scores that were insane and players winning by margins that we weren't really comfortable with because it didn't feel like they played that much better than the other players. They just got a card that was easier to lean into or that worked really well. So that was an interesting design decision around inventors. And so we actually changed how we scored those to make sure that they all had the same cap and they all had the same bottom as well. So 2 to 4 points.
Yeah, in a way to translate into Nippon, it's like we made each card have 2 stars in a way. So here's how you get your first star. If you get, say, 4 blue influence, you've got 1 star. But if you get 7 blue influence, you've got 2 stars. What I liked about we did with that in the end was that you could kind of tick the box on some. They might be like, say, get 2 or 4 of this colored workshop tile. That's the thing you can't lose in the game. Some of them you can lose. You can lose influence. You could lose colored dice, that kind of stuff. So you have to keep an eye on them. But there were some where it's like, once you've achieved it, you can just ignore that board, that scoring condition. Don't worry about it anymore. Keep it out of your mind because inventors, it's a lot more complex than Nippon. There's a lot more going on, a lot more to consider. So anything in the game where you can go, I can forget about that now, I find kind of like a relief. Like, put it out of your mind, focus on this thing now. And that's I enjoy that in inventors where it's like, if I am trying to score 3 or 4 boards or maybe 5, keeping all that in your head is just like, it's too much. But we solved it, like Sam said, with the thing of like capping them, much like Nippon caps with the stars. And we did have comments from playtesters saying like, oh, I enjoy the old system where I could like really abuse this one scoring thing, but it was just too much. And it just did do the blowouts that we didn't want to have in the game. So yeah, Nippon obviously has a very similar way of fixing the issue.
One of the really interesting things to discuss, I think, in this game is replay value. We talk a lot about replay value and the things that drive replay value for us. And a trend that I've noticed a little bit with reviewers that maybe makes me just a little bit salty is when they will play a game and they haven't played it very much and they say something like, oh, in about 5 or so games time, I think we'll be done with it. But then you know that they're like never actually going to get around to playing it again. And like it's a knock on the game for something that is kind of they haven't actually tested out and they haven't tried, like to see if they're actually done with the game or not. I guess you can start to trust your own instincts for sure. I like to just ask myself, do I want to play this again? Like that's my question for replayability. And then like, why do I want to play this again? What am I trying to experience? What's the thing that's driving that desire to play again or not? I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about this. What drives replayability for you for this game, and do you want to play again?
There's two big factors for Nippon that do push replayability for me. One is the interaction, and the other one is more just like trying to get better at the game. Because the puzzle is so fun and so challenging to do that min-maxing that you just can't you can't often do. I really enjoy that. My brain really enjoys that process. With the wrinkle of other players getting in my way, makes for a very enjoyable experience. And like even after 2 games, I feel like I've played well, but I know I've like misplayed so many actions within those 2 games that I know I can do better. So it's really that mastery thing that I want to play it again for that reason. There is some variation in the game, which often drives a lot of replayability for modern Euro games, with like lots of different things that will come out that won't come out the next game, whatever. This game doesn't really give you any difference in the game as such as like in a game where it's like, oh, there's 12 factories, but you only put out 4 each game. It's not like that. They're always available. The tiles rotating on the board and changing on the cities where the goods go. It's variation, but it doesn't really change the feel in any way. So it's just kind of it makes the board feel a little bit different than the last place, slightly. But I do like that the factories are different, and you do have this way of like trying different things. I think obviously that will sort of taper off within a few plays because you maybe after 4 or 5 plays you've maybe built every factory in the game, or at least built the ones that feel more interesting, different, and push different play styles. But really the replay for me really is like it's the tastiness of the puzzle with the trying to do better than your opponents, because this game is very competitive. That's one big part of it, and it's not just a little heads down solo game. You have to pay attention to what they're doing, and you want to win. That's the thing, right? Some games like Euro games, you're just happy playing. Like you're just happy building your tableau, doing your thing, moving your piece, and it's enjoyable and fun, and you enjoy all the various paths you could go down, all the replay and variation between game to game. It's fun and satisfying. This is not that game. This game is like tense, and it's very like I want to beat you. That's the feeling you get at the table, and I want to be smarter than you. And like when you don't win, which is quite often playing against Sam, you want to get better. You want to play again.
It's interesting what you talk about with variation in this game, because I'm not one that thinks, oh, we need to put all this variation in these games. But I definitely noticed it in this that it was a little lacking. You know, it feels like if this was Nippon of 2024, that the 4 different regions on the map with the bonuses would have little tiles that get placed out, which have more varied and interesting bonuses that change from game to game. 4 of the 5 action pools, the ones that have 2 actions there, that those would be action tiles that get shuffled and rotated around, and that those actions get paired off in different ways each game. Perhaps, as you suggested, Shem, that there would be more factories. I am a little bit predisposed to like the idea of actually all of the factories are there from the start, because I like this idea in Terra Mystica, where in Terra Mystica, there's always the exact same favor tiles, and you get to know them really, really well, and you get to know like all the standard openings, and you plan out your openings. The game becomes a little more rote for like what are the viable plays. And I imagine if you did play this lots and lots of times, there would be like a meta that develops around the early factories, the early silk and paper factories that get taken, that like are just better. But we didn't play enough to figure this out. And so that is one of my biggest things for replay value in this game, as Shem has said, is the systems mastery. I think that is super high, that there is still a lot that I could learn in this game and a lot that I could get better at. The interaction is awesome, and I love interaction in games, but it isn't the interaction for me that I find to be like the most Moorish that makes me want to come back. I think the types of interaction that I find the most Moorish is in a game like Citadels, where I start to know how you as a player like to play, and I start to use that information against you and go into all of these levels of mind games. So like Zach is always going to pick the assassin in this in this point, or he's always going to pick the merchant in this point if you played Citadels. So I'm going to assassinate the merchant. And then Zach's like, he's going to assassinate the merchant. So I'm taking the king. And you get into all these layers. Maybe it starts to become arbitrary, and maybe it isn't as smart and mind gamey as you think, and it could just be roll a die. But I like that style of interaction where it's like I do things differently because not reactive, not because I've seen what you've done, but proactive because I think I know what you're going to do. And I guess that could be there in this game, but it wasn't quite as strong for me, which isn't a knock on the game or the game's interaction. It's just simply a knock on the replay value for me, because the variation isn't there. And so ultimately, I'm not sure I need to play this again, even though I really, really love this game. And I think it's like a fantastic piece of game design. They've done an amazing job, and there isn't much I would change. I'm not really excited about playing again because I'm not sure what I would want to do differently, like what other path I would want to explore.
For me, I definitely want to play it again. Talking about it now has made me feel like playing it again. And I was thinking about it before, why that is. And I think it's the combination of, for me, this game has a really difficult puzzle where you never feel like you've quite done as good as you could have, or you should have, or you wanted to. And so that's really challenging where you're like, oh, next time I want to do those things, and I want to get that sort of factory earlier, or I want to max out this track, and not just I want to max out that track, but I want to max it out before the first victory scoring moment, because there's timing in the game as well. So it's not just, oh, I maxed it out by the end of the game, but it's like, oh, I want to do that thing before that moment in the game so that it can set me up for the next part of the game, So it's the combination of how difficult that puzzle is and how challenging it is and feeling like you're never quite there with how simple the game is. The game is just so easy to jump in and start playing and understand everything that was going on. I think I started reading the rule book, and sometimes rule books can feel dense, and then I watched the how to play video and I'm like, oh, game's easy. Like, easy to play, not easy to play, if you get what I'm saying. So the combination of being like, I could just jump into a game now, don't have to use a lot of brain space in terms of like understanding how to play, because sometimes you play a game you've already played, but you have to be like, okay, how do I play this game again? Because it's really complex and convoluted, and you got to understand all the moving parts. So it's really easy to jump into, but then really hard to actually do what you want to do in the game. And I think the combination of these two things, it just makes me want to play it again, because it's really easy to jump into another game and it's really hard to feel satisfied like I did all I should have done. And maybe that's because I came last in both games, and maybe the reason Sam doesn't want to play again is because he won both games, but I'll leave that to the audience to decide.
I think you're right, and it does come back again to me like the min-maxer bait, where there's so much of that in the game that you're constantly feeling like, and maybe it's not even possible, but constantly feeling like I could have got more out of this action somehow. And maybe there actually wasn't a way to get more out of the action based on the decisions that you made. But it feels like there was more juice to be squeezed, and there's ways to sequence it that could have been better or stronger. So I think that is a real strength for the replayability of this game.
Sorry, I just want to say I wouldn't underestimate the elegance aspect. That's what I was getting at, right? What Shem talks about. This is an elegant game, and elegant games are just so much easier to understand and to play. And I wouldn't underestimate that, because so much about replay as well is about like how easy a game is to get to the table. And so I think elegant games are much easier to get to the table, much easier to teach people. So maybe there's that replay value of just being like, oh, I could just rock this out and easily teach this to some friends and have a game. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion about Nippon, but we'd love to hear from you. Jump on the Garfield Games Discord and let us know in the podcast channel if you've played Nippon. Is it a game that you want to play again? What drives board game replayability for you? All right, let's finish off with this question. If you could redesign any board game that exists, which one would you choose?
For me, this would be a game I played at Gen Con last year, I think it was. Yeah, so just over a year ago. Game I immediately liked after playing it in the demo, and then bought it and then played it and still enjoy it. This is a game called Ancient Knowledge. So I really like this game a lot. There's so much to enjoy in it. It's very card heavy, which I like, and it has this ancient theme, which is like catnip for me. But what I would change if I was to redesign it is I'd probably make it about one civilization. We've talked about this a bit in our second episode, I think, where I like games that focus a bit closer than just like here's all of history or here's all of the ancient world and just pick one because you can tell a more interesting story and you learn a bit more about those people rather than just Earth in general. So I'd probably pick one interesting civilization that was about lots of building and culture and stuff. So you're probably looking at like Greeks or Romans, probably. But maybe there's something else you can go for. I would redesign the builder cards slightly, the interface of them. One kind of part I don't like in the game is how when you get cards that drop off your player board, you kind of play them down, a bit like Viscounts, they'll eventually drop off. And that is the timer in the game. Once players get, I think it's 14 cards in the past, the game ends. But managing those cards is a bit messy. Some will drop off and you don't care about them anymore, other than like certain icons for achieving certain goals. But there's other cards that like give you scoring focuses, so you kind of want to keep them visible so you can see them. And I can't remember if there's any ongoing ones, but I don't think there is. So I would probably redesign them so that the cards can always just sit in like a column and that you can clearly see all the information you need when they're in that column. But there's another messy part of the past is that you can tap cards for benefits. I forget what they are exactly, but there's like you can tap 2 or 3 cards to like draw cards or something along those lines. That's quite messy because now you've got this massive like scattered tableau off the side of your player board to manage and which cards have I tapped, which haven't I, and can I see the abilities? So I would probably add more components to be fair, like tokens you can place on these to show that you have used them for that power, or have a track that just goes up every time a card drops off the pass, it goes up and you spend that track. There's probably a way to add more tracks to help with the UI of the game as well. I get that it's very simple and like the fact they don't have these things is part of the appeal. Like to any game with cards, if you can go like more and more into the card thing, that's cool because like cards can do everything in the game for you. But I think the game could have had a slightly better UI for that area. I would have built a solo game from the start, would have put a solo bot in the box. I think the expansion is coming out with a solo mode, but the game is already quite solo, so why not have one from the start? The other thing I would add is more technology cards because every game I've played, those technology cards have run out, which isn't cool. You want to have like tons that you haven't seen or that sort of thing. So I'd probably almost double how many technology cards there are in the game and have more interesting stuff going on with those as well.
Cool. So I would choose a really obscure, not very well known game called Root.
This is verging on heresy. You're gonna lose 100 listeners. Go on. Get your popcorn out.
Don't send me hate mail, please. Don't send me hate mail. So Root has like a really cool theme, a lot of really cool stuff going for it. But one thing that I absolutely detest is combat. Just rolling 2 dice to resolve combat for me, it does not push any of my buttons. That would be the first thing that I would change, would be introducing a combat system that has a bit more kind of player agency in terms of resolving that combat. Whether that would be in some way using the cool card system that they have with the 4 suits, that could be an interesting way to resolve combat. But basically adding more player agency into how that combat is resolved. I always like to have a little bit of kind of ability to bluff also in combat. I like there being a slight element of that, and it can be strong or quite minor, but I like there to be a little bit of that power for the person who is maybe looking weaker to have a chance to win, but the person who's stronger to have a greater probability of winning. And I like to also play on people's greed, where the person who is probably going to win can also do really greedy plays, which could end up losing them the battle. But if they win the battle, then they get extra benefits. So that'd be the first thing. And the second thing that I would change would be I really like some of the factions in the game, but I feel like you kind of get railroaded into playing a similar way, especially for some of the factions more than others. So kind of having a few more viable paths that you feel like you can take, different play styles for each of the factions that are possible. And the third thing would just be some way reducing the time of each player's turn, because especially when you play higher player count games, it can just become ridiculous. Both how long you have to wait for it to become your turn, but also how much the play state changes between your turns. So although it's a game much loved by many, and I say please don't send me hate mail, for my kind of personal area control and asymmetric game things that I liked, those are kind of three areas of the game that I had frustrations, and I would redesign.
A game that I would redesign is a game called Federation. Federation is kind of like a Euro game where you're scoring victory points. It's got some really, really cool things going on. Players have workers that are these like really nice poker chip discs that have two sides, and they're going to place their workers on one of those sides. One of the sides is like a vote, and it's going to contribute towards voting. The actions are placed out in rows and columns, and it's going to contribute towards gaining points at the end of the round based on rows. And so some of your action like markers have higher influence amounts, so they're stronger for votes. And then the other side, placing it funding side, is going to contribute towards in-game scoring based on the column that you place it in. So there's a really interesting puzzle, and it might also give you an immediate boost as well for placing that worker. And the way that they do the rows and the columns and the two sides of the workers is a really, really fascinating puzzle. And I think it's super cool. Where the game falls short for me is that all of these actions that you are doing with these workers lean into 6 different mini games. And I sort of just felt like the mini games weren't that fun in the game. And I'm not actually opposed to having games with mini games. Like Viscounts of the West Kingdom kind of is a mini game. There's sort of 3 mini games or 4 mini games in that game. But in this one, I just felt like they were a little lackluster, and they could have had a little bit more shine, more interesting ways of engine building, and more interesting ways of interacting with those mini games. And so a redesign on all of those, I think, would be really cool.
Thanks for listening to the Lens and Veil podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Garfield Games. You can follow Garfield on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, and YouTube, or by joining the Garfield Discord server.